campus of Xavier University.
Look.
WBOK 1230 AM. Go. An Equity Media Station.
I'm Amber Payton with 4 things you should know with BIN News. According to the California Budget and Policy Center, black women in California make just 60 cents for every dollar a white man earns, and black single mothers make 56 cents. This pay gap is partly due to white men holding high-paying jobs while women of color are in low-wage roles like home health care. Black New York City Mayor Eric Adams is slamming former Governor Andrew Cuomo, accusing him of mishandling COVID and neglecting black and brown communities during vaccine distribution. Cuomo's team fired back, calling Adams a desperate man and an agent of Trump. Black Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson is racing to close the budget gap, facing pushback on a $175 million pension payment from Chicago Public Schools. And Michelle Obama says running for president is, quote, unthinkable, end quote, citing the sacrifices children make when a parent holds the role. Despite this, a Reuters Ipsos poll last summer showed her beating President Trump in a hypothetical matchup. Get BIN News on demand 24/7 on the iHeartRadio app.
It's now time for Let's Elevate, the Arnie and Carey Show with Arnie Filko and Carey Grant.
Good evening, everyone. This is the Arnie and Carey Let's Elevate show. This is Carey Grant.
And this is Arnie Filko. Hello, Carey. How's it going?
Oh, it's going great, going great.
Carey is in studio, and I am outside tonight due to another commitment, but we are very excited. We got a great show, I think, tonight, and so many things happening, Carey. Nationally, locally, we do not run out of topics for us to discuss, do we?
Never.
But tonight we're gonna start at least the first 30 minutes. We'll see how it goes. Talking about a really important topic, which is the 4 constitutional amendments in Louisiana that are subject to vote this Saturday. And that's right. This Saturday is an election day here across the state of Louisiana. And early voting, I believe, is stopped. So you need to come to the polls this Saturday. Like many off-year elections, especially ones that involve amendments, usually turnout is not very high. I heard today that I think I heard that the state turnout so far has been pretty dismal at about 6%. So we need New Orleanians and anybody hearing our voices tonight to get out and vote this Saturday. It's important. We're going to find out tonight. These are 4 hugely important amendments that will affect your life and the future in our state. So, without further ado, Carey, I'd love to welcome our guest tonight. Paul, are you there?
Yes, Paul's here. We have him on the line.
Okay, hey, Paul, this is Paul Brown, and I'm gonna read a short bio that Paul was nice enough to send me. Paul is a tax policy analyst for an organization called Invest in Louisiana, studying how the state's tax structure and spending affect low and middle income Louisianans and the services they rely on. Paul is a native of Denton Springs, Louisiana, and a lifelong Louisiana resident. He's a graduate of LSU, LSU's Manship School of Mass Communications, earning a BA in Mass Communication with a concentration in print journalism. Prior to joining LPP, Paul worked as a journalist for WRKF and WWNO, Louisiana's largest national public radio member stations, where he covered the state's budget, education system, reproductive rights, and the response to healthcare crises and natural disasters. He's based in Baton Rouge. Welcome, Paul. We greatly appreciate your expertise and insight.
Absolutely, but thank you so much for having me. It's a very important issue, so I appreciate having the platform.
So what I want to try to do tonight is go through these amendments in a very easy to understand way, if that's possible. Especially, we know Amendment 2 especially is very convoluted, very complex. But just let's kind of overview this. How did we get here? How do you even get to constitutional amendments that people are voting for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to start this conversation with that overview because just in the interest of full disclosure, Invest in Louisiana, our organization has deep concerns about each of these amendments we're seeing on the ballot. And, a lot of those concerns are born out of a process that is opaque, that didn't include people, it was rushed. And that process was abbreviated and crammed into a 20-day special session that was held last fall in November. It started the day after the presidential election. It ran until a few days before Thanksgiving, and it was incredibly consequential. It was a time when not a lot of folks were paying attention to state house politics here in Louisiana or around the country. I think the national political discussion had really taken a lot of the oxygen out of the room. But during that special session, Governor Jeff Landry and his allies in the legislature were able to pass massively consequential changes to our state's tax code. And these amendments were kind of at the time an afterthought. And, even as much as the whole session flew under the radar, these amendments flew even further under the radar. And all four of them came from this special session, and all four of them were put on this March 29th ballot. An election in the middle of March, not a particularly high turnout election. You
Right.
guys talked a little bit about the dismal turnout we've seen so far. Traditionally, when we're looking at these, I went and looked back at the last 5 or 6 years of these mid-March election dates, and turnout was typically in the 15 to 12% range for eligible voters. So incredibly low turnout, a process and very rushed. And especially when you consider the depth and the breadth of these constitutional changes that we're looking at. It's something that needs to have a robust, broad, public discussion around it before it even gets onto the ballot. And that was something that was missing from this process starting all the way back in November. And it's continued really in the lead up to this election with, I think there's a few organizations like Invest that I work for and partner organizations that are trying to get the word out on this. But it's been pretty quiet.
Paul, this is Carey. I agree with you totally about how this came about, because that whole session seemed like it was supposedly about finances and that type of thing, and that was the major focus. And yet these things came out of that session, and some of them absolutely have nothing to do with finances, and they're so far from finances, but were very seldom talked about and put together, like you said, very hastily and very clandestinely, and slapped together to come on the ballot with the part about the budget. So you're right. I mean, this was done really under the cover of darkness, and tried to put it on the ballot, where I've seen elections over the years where you try and put it on the ballot when there's not a lot going on, so you can try and sneak some of these things through. Yeah,
I mean, and I think the amendment to the rewrite of Article 7 of the state's constitution that deals, extensively with a lot of finance and budget aspects. That is, wasn't as much of a surprise. It still deserves a lot more robust public discussion than it got. But at least Governor Landry went into that session saying, hey, we want to look at our tax code.
Right.
We want to make these changes, and whether or not you agree with them or not, we at Invest do not agree with the approach that he took on those. He wasn't hiding the ball. He indicated what he wanted to do. I think where that gets complicated and murky is just with and how much they wanted to cram into a single ballot measure. It goes far beyond the normal requirement of a single issue that voters are typically tasked with when they're looking at these constitutional amendments. But if you look at the other three, amendments 1, 3, and 4, those have to do with our justice system, which was not a part of the public discussion at all going into this special session. It was snuck into.
Hello?
Oh, Governor Landry's call for that. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, Paul, you keep coming.
You're
keep
fading
going kind of in and out here.
Sorry about that. I hope that's a little better.
That's better.
But I was going to say, yeah, I'm not sure where I cut out, but the fact that lawmakers were even talking about our justice system at all last fall definitely flew under the radar. It was written into the governor's call for that session, sort of at the bottom, and I mean, frankly, I had my hands full. I know a lot of folks who were focused on the tax and budget side of things weren't following that as closely, and some very serious and serious consequences of that session are before voters now.
So we're going to get into each of these in just a second here. I just want to ask two questions. Number one, who does a low turnout election favor in a vote like this? Number one, and number two, I mean, as I understand it, you're right. I mean, all of the, especially with the tax reforms contained in Amendment 2, which, by the way, runs 115 pages, I think. All crammed into a few paragraphs that people are asked to go vote for. But
91 words on the ballot.
Wow.
It's what?
91 words. They condensed
91 words.
Pages into 91 words.
Which in and of itself has been legally challenged here. But I guess my question is we've seen constitutional tax reform before, but when they did it before, it was the subject of a lot of public input. It wasn't crammed into a 3-week session. Talk a little bit about that, because, again, I think people are very suspicious of this because of the way it was processed.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of parts to your question. Who does this benefit, this low turnout election? I think it depends a lot on what's going on the ballot and how it's framed. Certainly, the way that this has been framed, when you're condensing these very, very broad topics, and in the case of all 4 of these amendments, into something very small, and for many voters who are going into the booth on Saturday or have already voted, by mail or in person, for a lot of those voters, despite the best efforts of groups like mine, the only information they're going to get is what they're reading on their ballot.
Right.
So, being able to set the date, have a low turnout, there's not as much engagement from the news media or really anyone at all. It sort of benefits the status quo. It's a real home game for the folks who are proposing these amendments, and that's a big question there. And yeah, you talk about the last time that we had and we usually have something that deals with tax and spending woven into our constitutional amendments each time we have them. But something that comes to mind immediately for me is back in 2021. We had a different legislature back then, different governor, but we had a new Republican supermajority, and they passed a bunch of big, pretty sweeping changes at the time to our state's tax code in that spring of 2021, and they put them on the ballot on the next high turnout election day, which just so happened to be November of 2021, when the biggest item on the ballot across the state was the reelection of Mayor LaToya Cantrell in New Orleans. And we saw in that case, I think the Republicans who are running the show this go around really learned their lesson there, because they realized that their goals for these constitutional amendments didn't line up with the electorate in New Orleans, where the bulk of turnout was going to be. Similarly, I think if lawmakers, usually when you're making a constitutional change, you want to put it on the ballot around the typical traditional voting day in November. So we would have been looking at, once again, another mayoral election in New Orleans. And that just politically wasn't going to fly this go around. So that's why we've seen this March 29th date come to the top.
That's interesting, because they certainly could have waited had they wanted to. Carey, do we? I want to get into the amendments, but do we need to take a break, or could we keep going?
We can keep going so far. Yeah.
Okay. So, Paul, why don't we start? Let's hold Amendment 2 to the end, because that's probably the most complex one. Why don't we start with number 1, and if you could describe it and talk about if there are pros. Obviously, I think the audience would love to hear that, but certainly if you see deficiencies in it, we want to hear that. And by the way, we'd love for you to call us if you want to weigh in on this. 504-582-9422. Our guest tonight is Paul Brown, talking about the 4 constitutional amendments. So why don't we start with number 1, Paul? Why don't you go through that?
Sure. Yeah. So Amendment 1 has to do with specialty courts. That's not necessarily clear from the ballot language. The ballot language talks about giving the state Supreme Court jurisdiction to discipline out-of-state lawyers for unethical legal practices in the state of Louisiana. And then the kicker after the comma is, and to grant the legislature the authority to establish trial courts of limited and specialized jurisdiction.
Wow.
So the first part of that we can get through really quick because the state already has the authority and the jurisdiction to discipline out-of-state lawyers. That's a clear misdirect there. The rub is in that.
So
half.
let me just ask you, because I had dinner a couple of nights ago with one of the largest plaintiff PI attorneys in the state, and that's exactly what he said. He was like shocked that maybe we didn't have jurisdiction to govern out-of-state attorneys. So you're saying that is already in law. Why include it if that's the case?
I don't know that there's a lot of good reasons to include it. I think it murkies the waters up a little bit. I think it's a clear example of, sponsors of this legislation wanting to make one tiny little tweak. There may be some slight change in how the Supreme Court handles this discipline for out-of-state lawyers that justifies its inclusion of that element of the ballot language. But I mean, you'll see that, especially in Amendment 2. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but there's very clear points where they make certain changes where it's like this, we're kind of shoehorning this in. And a lot of reason for that is to garner widespread public support. And I think when people talk about disciplining lawyers, not exactly a group of people that's always beloved by the community at large. Right. And talking about unethical legal practices, people want to rein that in. So that is one example of rosying up this ballot language to make it have broad appeal.
Because the second part of it is something. Well, let's get to the creation of the specialized courts.
Absolutely. So these specialized courts that we're talking about, this isn't like a drug court or a veterans court that, handles cases with special interest areas within the set jurisdiction that those judges were elected to cover. This is essentially about taking court cases out of those home jurisdictions where they would ordinarily go, where local judges would be handling the proceedings, and putting them somewhere across the state. And to do this by subject matter in a lot of ways. One of the big examples that we've heard sort of kicked around as a possible scenario is having a specialty oil and gas court that handles, any kind of claims, whether it be a claim of an employee for unfair or unsafe working practices or an environmental claim made by a community and community stakeholders about something that's happening, say, in an oil and gas company's operation on the coast. It's, I think, really important that those cases are handled within those communities and are decided by juries who are also from those communities. But what we're dealing with here, we could move these in many cases to Baton Rouge because that's sort of the locus of power in the judicial system in Louisiana, or, moved even farther away from that. And also we're talking about legislators being able to hand select the judges who would handle these cases. And given, we've got Republican supermajorities in both chambers of the legislature. We've got a trifecta with the governor for Republicans, and those conservative ideals. I mean, there is no clear line between the politicization of the judiciary. It happens, and I think we need to be clear-eyed about that. And political appointees of these judges would obviously have some bent to the way that they're hearing these cases, and that raises some serious concerns.
Paul,
Another
we're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be right back.
Attention, WBOK listeners. Are you a fan of the station and want to show your support in style? Well, we've got some exciting news for you. Introducing the official WBOK merchandise, the perfect way to wear your love for the station. Whether you're a longtime listener or a new fan, we've got something for everyone. Head to WBOK1230.com now and grab your WBOK gear before it's gone. When you buy WBOK merch, you're not just getting quality items, you're supporting the station you love.
WBOK 1230 AM online at WBOK1230.com.
The Arnie and Carey Show with Arnie Philco and Carey Grant.
And we're
back tonight, and we are talking constitutional amendments. We're on amendment number 1. Paul, so on the specialized courts, let me ask you again a couple questions. So basically what you're saying is you could potentially have the legislature create a specialized court, appoint judges as opposed to having elected judges, putting them in whatever part of the state the legislature would deem appropriate. How, under the current system, if there was a need for a specialized court, for example, in juvenile court, in our area here in New Orleans, there are specialized areas of that, specialized almost subcourts of that. But what's the current system if this amendment did not exist?
Yeah, the current system would have basically those local courts pulling in. The specialty is with the judges. Their specialty is the law. And, the lawyers, their specialty is making the argument for their plaintiff or defendant in these cases. So, and they're able to call forward any specialized expertise, expert witnesses to come to those venues and to make the arguments. And then the determination shouldn't necessarily be based off of industry considerations or.
Yeah.
So you're basically usurping the role of our judges right now, who, if they feel it's appropriate, can want to create a special court, they can do that. If this amendment passes, we would be handing over that power to the legislature.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And we already have, if people feel like they didn't get the fair shake at the district court level for these things, we still have a robust case for appeals, both within the state court system and the federal court system, so they can take this on up the chain as needed. So the necessity isn't really there.
Right.
Got it. Carey, I'm going to jump you around a little bit, because I'm going to save number 3 also.
Go ahead.
Because that's a really important one. Let's go to number 4, which deals with elections. Why don't you describe that one?
Yeah, so number 4 has to deal with how we would fill judicial vacancies. And basically, it's meant to provide for the use of the earliest election date to fill judicial vacancies. Pretty simple. Frankly, it's
Hello?
We have on the ballot, but it does, raise some questions and is problematic. Because, we just talked about turnout. Not all election dates are created equally when we're talking about voter engagement. I know here in Baton Rouge, I went and voted for a couple of judges last April. I'm a diehard voter, chronic voter. They make it sound like a disease when they talk about it. But, I went at 6 p.m. to my local polling place here in Baton Rouge and, went to go sign the log. And I was maybe the 12th person in my precinct to participate in that. That doesn't feel like a robust democratic process to me. We want to have big turnout for these things, and we want to have a big debate on this. The way they're sort of talking about this is about expediency, but there isn't as much urgency when you have an interim judge in place, and that's sort of left out.
Yeah, and Paul, this is Carey. Also, part of the problem from my point of view is it also denies the candidates because, to mount a campaign, to, like you said, to be somebody who can present themselves, if somebody died in office in April and there was an election in July, you may not even be able to put together a campaign or anything to become a judge, and you may be highly qualified. So it causes a lot of issues on this one that have nothing to do with expediency. And it works fine now, as you said, particularly because there's always an interim judge or somebody appointed to the job for a while anyway. So.
Yeah, that's a
well, and
that's a great point, Carey. I mean, people sometimes don't realize that judicial elections are like every other election. The candidate has to, gather a team and get name recognition, and he or she can't raise direct money, but they have others that do it on their behalf. So, rushing it, could really, put the wrong candidates into office. I guess, Paul, one of the questions I'd have on this amendment is, where are the judges around the state? Do they support this? Do they like it, or is it problematic in their opinion?
Oh, I can't speak for the judges. I don't know. I know plenty of advocates who work below that level within the system, have concerns. I think you get when you're talking about judges, tend to be very individualistic. As you break it down, not a whole lot of voting blocks when you're talking about judges overall. So I couldn't really say one way or the other. But I did want to add, something when we're talking about this. Carey made the great point of like the speed of this makes it difficult to mount a campaign. There's also within this, it's not mentioned at all in the ballot language, but the fine print of this change would also allow the interim judge, a political appointee, to run in these quick turnaround elections, which turns them, especially when you have low turnout, you've got low name recognition for candidates who have to like mount a campaign and set it up. The incumbency benefit of a political appointee
absolutely.
who may only be an incumbent for a couple of weeks, couple of months, it turns these things into a coronation, and that's not what you want for this democratic process.
That's true. Yes,
No,
it's
not. All right. Well, Carey, you good? I'm going to keep moving this if I could.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go to number 3. This one has garnered a fair amount of interest, I think, around the state because of what it does, what it potentially will do. Let's describe that, Paul.
Yes. So, once again, I'll start with the ballot language on this, and it asks if you would support an amendment to provide the legislature the authority to determine which felony crimes, when committed by a person under the age of 17, may be transferred for criminal prosecution as an adult. This is about putting kids in adult prisons.
Yes.
And, I think it's really important and be very clear-eyed about what our current policies are. Because right now, first of all, the cutoff for an adult in Louisiana in the criminal courts is different than if you're going to vote, if you're going to, join the military, all these other, if you want to go into a bar. It's not 18, it's 17. You're an adult after the age of 17 in the eyes of the Louisiana court system. Now, when you're talking about people who commit, kids who commit crimes under that age, there are provisions within state law that give district attorneys the discretion to bring those juvenile offenders, people charged with those crimes, into the adult court system in a select list of crimes. These are serious crimes, heinous crimes in many cases. We're talking about murder. We're talking about aggravated rape, carjackings on the list. These are serious crimes. And this is a privilege, a power that district attorneys avail themselves of often. Right. They have the authority to do this, and to leave out that from the ballot language really changes the way that a lot of people might see this. And I think it's very important to have that context. as we're going into it.
These currently enumerated crimes are for 14 through 16-year-olds, correct?
That's correct. Yes,
right.
And this would give the legislature the authority to lower that number however they see fit. I mean, I've heard all the way down to 9. There's a lot of issues in transparency with this because there's such a disconnect between what is being presented to the public and what current law already is.
Right.
And that's extended to the legislators that are proposing this. When asked, what crimes are we talking about here? What are we looking at? Because the list is already inclusive of all the serious crimes that, anybody might be concerned about and want to see these taken to, that higher level. The sponsor couldn't name a crime. The crimes that they named were already on the list. We already had the ability to do this. So, I mean, you're getting down to like robbery of an item of $1,000. I mean, that's an iPhone.
Yeah.
We don't want to trivialize, criminal activity, but, kids make mistakes. It's
right.
There's brain chemistry at play here. You don't fully develop impulse control until you're 25 years old. And we're not talking about 24-year-olds. We're talking about 14-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds. So where do we draw the line here? And
right.
yeah, I mean, that's particularly concerning for those reasons. And then once you do try a juvenile as an adult, okay, well, now you're putting them in an adult criminal legal system. How's that going to go? Because when you look at recidivism rates, we do a much better job of rehabilitating kids that we put in the more rehabilitative, softer juvenile justice system. When you put a young offender, whether they're, under the age of 17 or sort of in that early, late teens, early 20s range into the adult criminal system, recidivism rates surge. This is how we lose people within this system and create people who are stuck within these patterns of criminal behavior because they've got no other option and they've been conditioned by these really tough environments within our jails and prisons.
And another piece to this too is that it allows the whims of the legislature, which has a lot of hyper-conservative people in it, to put some of those crimes, like you said, some of those what we would consider minor crimes, almost misdemeanors, into that category based on some feeling about something that's going on in their parish or whatever. And that is a dangerous weapon to have, where you can just walk into the legislature and say, well, this is a crime that you need to go through all of those processes that, somebody who's much older or much more of a hardened criminal has committed. So that this one doesn't fly for a lot of people, I know.
Well, and I think what you said, Paul, really resonates, is that the purpose of the juvenile system is so much different than the adult system. I mean, when a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old goes into the juvenile system here for a crime that was committed, I mean, it's not as punitive. It really tends to go more towards the goal of rehabilitation. That's why there's school courses, educational courses. When you get into adult prison and you're in Angola or somewhere else, I mean, it really is in a lot of ways punitive, So, I mean, these have different goals. I guess I want to understand something, and maybe our listening audience feels this as well. The enumerated offenses right now that a district attorney would have discretion as to whether to charge adult or juvenile, those enumerated offenses are within what? The Constitution right now or state statute?
They exist in state statute. And, probably a decent time to talk about what a constitution ought to do. It's right. About giving people rights. When you think about the rights that an individual has, many of them are found within the Constitution. And this is not so much about that. It's more about granting authority to restrict rights and protections.
Right. Wait, Paul, but here's my question. If there was such a need, for this, if there were offenses out there, which it seems like there's not, but if there were offenses out there that DAs felt, we need to charge as adults versus as a juvenile. I mean, couldn't each year legislators bring that offense up as a new piece of legislation that, if passed, would go into law as part of a statute? I mean, I guess I'm trying to understand why this is even needed. If somebody really believes that there's offenses out there that we're not covering.
I mean, it's not. It's posturing.
Yeah.
It's a tough on crime. It is public affairs more so than it is about our judicial system and addressing an actual need, which, I think aligns with what we've seen publicly from the administration of Governor Landry and from his allies in the legislature.
One thing you said that was very true is, and I would think this is very much the case, if this was a thing that was needed by DAs, the DAs in the state of Louisiana are very powerful, and I think they would be advocating for something like this if they needed something like this to do their jobs. And the fact that they don't seem to be as fired up about this as some others might be in the process tells me that this is not something that they really need right now or want to be involved in, something with more stringent juvenile laws.
And yeah, I mean, it's not hard you'll often see DAs, they're not going to say no to another tool in their toolkit as they see it to prosecute these crimes and to, make their job work. And they take that seriously. And they do that at the political level, advocating for themselves robustly and are fixtures at the legislature.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, they weren't begging for this or seeking this out. I think some of them may be pleased to have the extra tool in their toolkit, but this is in a lot of ways kind of out of left field.
Right.
Yeah, and let me throw this in there. I'm certainly not anti-DA. I mean, we have some very good district attorneys around the state, and some very fair district attorneys around the state. But as we just saw in the last 30 days with a couple of our district attorneys, they are not reluctant to go, pro. I don't know how you want to say it, but really, really conservative. And we saw the imposition of the death penalty, and the killing of an inmate, because the DA wanted to go in that direction. So these are really significant issues. When you give discretion to an elected official, you are putting your trust in that individual. And given what we've just discussed this evening, not only does it seem to be not necessary, but it could be a very dangerous situation as we go into the future.
And expensive. I know we talked a lot about, issues of jurisprudence and fairness and effectiveness when we're talking about rehabilitating, children who commit crimes. But let's also talk about cost, because, okay, let's say you want to put a kid in adult prison for a crime they committed. It's on this list now. You can do that. The state has the authority to do that. But the federal government says, okay, but if you do that, there's a requirement that you keep those children within the adult facilities, separate in sight and sound from adult inmates at all times.
Yeah.
And that is a significant administrative challenge. We saw about a year and a half ago, a juvenile justice system, facility was shut down because of issues with breakouts and all kinds of things around that. And they temporarily brought a defunct cell block back online. And that was a debacle in a lot of ways. First of all, these adult facilities are already crowded and crumbling in many cases. But we saw lawsuits come out of that as well, that the state was unable to separate the children in all of those ways. They had they could hear adults through the wall, or they would pass the adults routinely on the way to the mess hall, because there are some shared facilities that you just can't get around.
Right.
So there is, we already have these separate juvenile facilities, and also we see in juvenile facilities a lot more leeway to do supervised release and rehabilitation that way. So when we're cramming more people into our already overcrowded adult system and adding these extra layers of administrative burden on top, it gets a lot more expensive. So just, an argument, a consideration to make if you're not concerned about the humanity of all of this. Something else out there for people to chew on.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into the big one, number 2. And by the way, number 3 is hugely important. I don't want to minimize it. Yes. Because it affects our entire criminal justice system. But I think a lot of the public spotlight, with editorials and op-eds and everything, has been on number 2. We got about 15 minutes, and I know we can't probably give it due justice, but let's try. Why don't you try to break down component by component each of the aspects of Constitutional Amendment 2?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've the other 3 amendments on this ballot, but as a tax and budget policy analyst, Amendment 2 has been like my job exclusively. I've been in the weeds on this for a little while. But I think a good place to start with this is the ballot language. And just from the top, like we talked about this, 115 pages of changes to our state's constitution condensed into 91 words. Wow. So just on its face, it's woefully inadequate. And in the case of many of the claims within the ballot language, deliberately misleading. And we'll try to pick apart as much as we can. It's a little easier to try to break this down into 15 minutes. It's not quite as tough as getting it down into 91 words, but there's still some stuff we're going to miss. But
okay, let's give it a try.
Let's give it a shot. So the language says, do you support an amendment to revise Article 7 of the Constitution, including revisions to increase income tax deductions for citizens over 65, provide for a government growth limit, modify operation of certain constitutional funds, provide for property tax exemptions, retaining the homestead exemption and exemptions for religious organizations, put an asterisk there, provide a permanent teacher salary increase by requiring surplus payment to teacher retirement debt. A doozy of about some ballot language there, but that doesn't even scratch the surface of what we're dealing with in this amendment. We can take that piece by piece. Where should we start?
Well, why don't we start with income tax reduction and sales tax increase, and what does that actually mean for the average person out there?
Yeah, well, so first of all, it's not a reduction in the personal income tax rate. And that was the main thrust of this special session that all these amendments came from last fall, was to abandon the state's graduated personal income tax structure and swap it out for a flat 3% personal income tax rate and an increase in the standard deduction. So essentially create like a 0 bracket for lower income individuals and then a 3% bracket for everybody else. And what we saw with that was that it overwhelmingly benefited high earning individuals in Louisiana and filers in Louisiana. And to offset that cost, so doing so, it reduced state revenue by about $1.1 billion. To offset that, the state then did a lot of different things. But I think the most important thing to look at is the sales tax increase. Bumped the state sales tax up to 5% from its current 4.45%. And that gives, the state of Louisiana, if you look around the state, the highest combined state and local sales tax rate in the country.
Paul, we're going to take a quick break.
$1.1 billion.
Paul, hold on. We're going to take a quick break and come back and break down the rest of it.
On last week's From the Press Box to Press Row with Donald Ware.
Larry Vickers, the head women's basketball coach. Coach Vickers, congratulations. Like we were talking about the whole video game thing. Where are you with that?
They lost me a little bit in 2024 Call of Duty. They kind of changed some things in the system that I haven't loved.
It sounded like a couple of excuses to me. Like if one of your players came to you and said similar, I don't think you would accept that.
This year I didn't talk any trash. I didn't say anything. It's just, I'm enjoying retirement, I guess. I just feel sabbatical.
From the press box to press row as one of the hottest sports talk shows in the country. Join Donald each week as he takes you on a journey through the world of HBCU sports and pro sports and interviews with top sports and entertainment figures. That's from the press box to press row.
Fridays on WBOK 1230 AM. What New Orleans is talking about.
Trying to grow your business or increase traffic to your location? We can help. WBOK 1230 AM has a number of solutions that will meet your individual needs. Give one of our consultants a call today at 504-582-9420 or email us at info@wbok1230.com. And remember, an investment with WBOK is an investment in our community. Call today.
WBOK 1230 AM. Listen now on WBOK1230.com.
The Arnie and Carey Show with Arnie Filko and Carey Grant.
We are back.
All right, everyone. We're back in the last 15 minutes or so. Well, Paul, I know this is really unfair to you, and I wish we had more time. But let's do the Cliff Notes version of Amendment number 2 here. You started by talking about the income and sales tax. Why don't you keep going?
Yeah, so what we were talking about just before the break there, those are changes that are already made. We lowered the state's personal income tax rate to 3%. We raised the state sales tax to 5%. Amendment 2 would have no direct impact on that. What it would do is set a cap on the personal income tax rate at 3.75%, which would make it difficult. It would really limit we couldn't go back to the structure that we had before with a top rate of 4.25%. We couldn't go back to what we had, back in 2020 when we had a top bracket of 6%. We've had some significant changes in our personal income tax structure, and this would lock those in essentially by making it much more difficult to do that. And as we saw the legislature when they were faced with offsetting that loss of revenue, they did it by raising the sales tax, which is incredibly regressive. It really hits lowest income Louisianans the hardest.
Yes.
And is something, that wouldn't change at all. And there's really very little way to address that given some of the changes and sort of preserving an amber Amendment 2 would do to that aspect of our state tax code.
And there's a tax deduction that's being increased for seniors. Is that basically just a carrot that's being thrown here in order to get support? And similar to teacher pay, which we'll get to in just a second.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can't really say anything bad about the increase in tax deductions for senior citizens. Like you can argue about priorities or whatever, but like that's important to a lot of people. And I won't argue against that. I would just say, for folks who are seeing that and wanting to vote on that exclusively, you need to look at everything else around it because there are trade-offs.
Yep.
Right.
That would
Let's talk a little bit about
that age.
Let's talk a little bit about teachers.
Yes.
Because one of the things that the proponents of this are out there saying is that this is going to ensure more teacher pay, $2,000 a year and $1,000 for staff. But how do we get to that point? And is this really long term, or is this again more of a sweetener in order for people to vote for this? Because I do want to recognize that one of the larger teacher unions has endorsed, number 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is sort of a combination. I mean, you talked about the tax deductions for folks over 65 as a carrot. This teacher pay thing is the combination of a carrot and a stick at the same time.
Yeah.
From the top, this is not a pay raise. What this would do in a best case scenario is just backfill, replace the $2,000 stipend that teachers have received for the last 2 years from the legislature. Lawmakers have already said, they haven't found the money to do that again. What they would do is it's sort of a gambit that would eliminate 3 constitutionally protected funds that fund education. Combined, those 3 funds have a balance of about $2 billion. And what we've done for the last 20 years or so is take the interest that those funds earned and invest it into education at every level in the state. Last year, we got about $68 million in interest that was available for appropriation, and that went to 1,600 seats in the early childhood education program. It went to direct funding for special education programs in K through 12 schools. It went to higher education funding. So really spread all across the education system, every level there. That would go away. Those $2 billion would be swept into an early payment on debt held by the Teachers Retirement System of Louisiana. And that would, in theory, get them to the point where teacher pay would be about $2,000 in some cases. There are some problems. There's some big asterisks with this as well, because not all teachers in Louisiana pay into TRSL.
Right.
Teachers, notably in charter schools, in y'all's neck of the woods, all charter system with a few minor exceptions. Those teachers are not in TRSL. So what is being done about them? How does this work? The mechanics don't really address that. And there are some big questions. Governor Landry has said that he would make them whole to make this work out, but it's hard to see exactly where that money would come from. It's already tight given how many cuts we've seen to state revenue from that special session already.
Yeah.
Right.
We have
the other
one
area
more.
I want to ask you to weigh in on, Paul, is the issue of services that could be cut under this.
Yeah.
There are some caps on spending, and what potentially could be detrimentally affected?
Yeah, I mean, government growth limit. So that is proposed in this constitutional amendment would in state government from the state general fund. There's a lot of technical aspects of it, but at its core, this is an arbitrary limit on state spending that would be basically say, you can spend, when you look at the state general fund, whatever you spent last year, you can multiply by the sum of consumer price index for normal goods, consumer price index for healthcare costs, and the change in the state's population. And that's all you can spend in the out year. Of general fund spending. But this would tend to hit the parts of state government that are hit quite often when we're talking, like anytime we're looking at budget cuts in Louisiana, what do we hear in the headlines? There's concerns at universities, there's concerns in our health system. Those are the folks that would get hit hard by this as well. There'd be belt tightening there. It would also just mechanically, there's a lot of challenges to, how do we shuffle things around? Because any expenditures over that growth limit could be one-time expenditures. How much leeway do we have? What administrative hurdles are we putting in place here? I will just say this isn't a novel thing. This is, an ideological thing that came out of Colorado in the 90s. And, it was praised in ultra-conservative circles, but at the same time, like on the ground in Colorado, it's had disastrous consequences for their state budgeting, and they had a bipartisan push to suspend it for about 5 years. This is maybe 12 years ago, and that lapsed. And because it's in their constitution, they can't get it out, and it's made things difficult there. For
Paul,
all levels of.
We only got a couple minutes left. Last question I have. Terry may have one, but the last question I have is: does this package, at the end of the day, really make a difference in the economic growth of our state? As the governor has said, I mean, we've seen over the last couple months some very big announcements. One just yesterday about a steel mill coming to Ascension Parish that is worth billions to the state, which is phenomenal. but they seem to, these economic wins seem to be based on reasons other than our tax structure right now.
Right.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, and this is, this I think goes beyond just my opinion and, Invest in Louisiana's opinion on these amendments in front of us. But I think a larger sort of ethos for the work that we do. I mean, we at Invest, and me personally, like, what attracts people to the state of Louisiana? And who are we trying to emulate, when we're making all of these very corporate-friendly tax cuts? If you look at the Tax Foundation, their top 10 list of states, at the top of the list is, Wyoming, it's Idaho, it's Arkansas maybe, and at the bottom of the list is New York and California. And I'm not going to say like there are differences in the tax structures of those states for sure, but I mean, New York and California are centers for
commerce,
global economy, not just the state economy. So you got to look at, Louisiana has a lot to offer. We don't need to get in this race to the bottom. And I think one of the best things that we can offer the people of Louisiana is we can invest in them. We can have educated kids and great social services and great infrastructure. And we need to raise taxes to do that, Frank.
We're going to end it there, and I just want to tell everybody, vote no on all four because there's too many complications.
I think that's what we concluded tonight.
Thank you, Paul.
Paul, thank you so much for describing all of this, and for everybody listening. It's really important Saturday that you get out to the polls and and vote for this. And we think these are all things that should be defeated. So, but use your own judgment, read up on them, get educated, and go to the polls on Saturday. We will be back tomorrow at a regular time, 6 to 7 p.m. Thank you again to Paul Brown from Invest in Louisiana, and we look forward to being with you tomorrow night.
See you tomorrow.